The bustling streets of Calgary were alive with a vibrancy that seemed to echo Shannon Madill's infectious spirit. Shannon, a 25-year-old comedian and aspiring actress, was the embodiment of determination and charm. Friends and family adored her quick wit and ability to light up any room she entered. With her auburn hair framing a face full of life, Shannon was a rising star, ready to make her mark on the world. Her career was gaining momentum. Just a week ago, she had secured an opportunity that could redefine her path, a casting call in Vancouver. For Shannon, it wasn't just about a new job, it was a ticket to a fresh start. But while she celebrated, her husband, Joshua Burgess, seemed indifferent. Shannon's laughter often echoed in their modest home, but Joshua's cold, distant demeanor stood in stark contrast. "You're always chasing something," Joshua muttered one evening as Shannon enthusiastically recounted her plans for the future. His words, laced with an edge of contempt, hung in the air. Shannon froze, searching his face for a trace of encouragement, but his eyes stayed fixed on the television screen. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Shannon confided in her brother, expressing growing doubts about her marriage. "He's just not the same anymore," she admitted over the phone. "I feel like I'm walking on eggshells." Her brother urged her to focus on her career and take the leap to Vancouver, a city where dreams seem more achievable. "You deserve to be happy," he reminded her. Shannon's heart swelled with hope, but a lingering unease clouded her excitement. That unease was palpable during the family dinner she never attended. Shannon had promised to join her parents and siblings to celebrate her latest milestone. The empty chair at the table sparked confusion, which soon turned to concern. By the end of the evening, her phone calls went unanswered, and messages remained unread. It wasn't like Shannon to vanish without a word. Joshua, meanwhile, played the role of a concerned husband flawlessly. When her family called, his voice was steady, almost rehearsed. "I haven't seen her since this morning," he told them. "She said she had some errands to run." Yet there was something about his tone, too calm, too calculated, that left Shannon's brother uneasy. As the hours turned into days, the family's anxiety deepened. Shannon's absence cast a shadow over their lives, her laughter now replaced by a deafening silence. Her friends flooded social media with posts pleading for information, while her parents contacted the police. "Shannon wouldn't just disappear," her mother insisted to an officer. "She's not that kind of person." Calgary's community rallied, sharing flyers and organizing search parties. But beneath the surface, suspicions began to simmer. Whispers about Shannon and Joshua's troubled marriage started to emerge. Friends recalled arguments and moments of tension, though Shannon had never hinted at anything violent. Joshua's stoic demeanor, once seen as grief, now raised questions among those closest to Shannon. One week into the search, Joshua called Shannon's brother with a chilling discovery. "I found her phone," he said, his voice flat. "It was in the living room under the couch." The revelation stunned everyone. How could her phone, her lifeline, have been there all along? The days following Shannon Madill's disappearance felt like an eternity for her family. The absence of her lively laughter and her quick, witty comebacks was a gaping void no one could fill. Calgary buzzed with flyers bearing Shannon's radiant smile, yet hope felt fragile. Every phone call brought anticipation, but the silence that followed was deafening. Joshua Burgess, Shannon's husband, maintained a calm yet detached demeanor. On the surface, he appeared helpful, answering the police's questions, distributing flyers, and even organizing a small search party with Shannon's friends. "We need to keep looking," he said with a flat tone during one meeting. His words sounded convincing, but his eyes betrayed nothing. However, cracks in his facade began to show. Shannon's closest friends whispered about the tension between the couple, a stark contrast to the picture-perfect relationship Joshua had presented. In private conversations, Shannon had confided in her best friend Lisa. "The open marriage thing was never my idea," Shannon had admitted. "It was all Joshua, and he hasn't stopped seeing other people, even after promising me he would." Lisa's voice trembled as she recounted those conversations to the police. She felt stuck, like she was the only one trying to make it work, Lisa explained. But the worst part was how he'd make her feel small, like her dreams didn't matter. While Shannon had confided in her friends, Joshua had his own narrative. To the police, he painted a picture of a wife burdened by career pressures. She was stressed about her auditions, he claimed during questioning. Sometimes she'd get so overwhelmed she'd just need to be alone for a while. Yet his account of Shannon's emotional state clashed sharply with what her family knew about her. a resilient and optimistic woman who embraced challenges. The investigation deepened when Shannon's brother shared a chilling detail with the detectives. Weeks before her disappearance, Shannon had spoken to him about a heated argument with Joshua. "He doesn't want me to leave Calgary," she had said. "He thinks I'm abandoning him, but I have to put myself first this time." Neighbors corroborated this tension. One neighbor, who lived adjacent to the couple, reported hearing shouting late at night a few days before Shannon vanished. "It sounded like they were arguing about something big," she told the police. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I can't stop replaying those moments." As more details surfaced, Shannon's family grew increasingly uneasy. Her mother, holding a photograph of her daughter, told reporters, "Shannon was strong, but even the strongest people have limits. She wanted to live her life and no one had the right to take that from her." Meanwhile, Joshua's behavior became erratic. During a public vigil for Shannon, he seemed distracted, avoiding eye contact with the grieving family. When asked by a reporter how he was holding up, his response raised eyebrows. "I'm just trying to get through this," he muttered, his voice devoid of emotion. The police, piecing together the fragments of Shannon's last days, began focusing on Joshua as a person of interest. His timeline of events was inconsistent, and his casual discovery of Shannon's phone felt contrived. "How did it end up under the couch?" Detective Wilson asked during an interview. Joshua shrugged. "Maybe she dropped it before she left. I didn't notice it until later." But the doubt in Wilson's eyes was clear. Shannon's closest friends described her as meticulous, always aware of her belongings. The idea that she would leave her phone behind, especially when she was planning to travel, didn't sit right. Questions swirled as Calgary's police force intensified their investigation. Did Shannon really leave the house that day? If not, why was her car found blocks away, abandoned? And why did Joshua's story seem so rehearsed? The tension was palpable as the community waited for answers. While Shannon's family held on to hope, there was an undeniable undercurrent of dread. Joshua, once seen as a supportive husband, was becoming a figure shrouded in doubt. The morning Shannon Madill disappeared began like any other. Neighbors reported seeing her leaving the house, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she headed to her car. A few even waved, unaware it would be the last time they'd see her. It wasn't unusual for Shannon to run errands in the neighborhood, so no one thought twice when she drove off. Later that afternoon, Shannon's family grew concerned. She had promised to meet her brother, but she never showed up. At first, they assumed she was delayed, perhaps caught up with her upcoming plans for Vancouver. But as hours turned into an unsettling silence, worry began to set in. Repeated calls went unanswered. Messages remained unread. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. When Shannon's parents called Joshua that evening, his voice was unnervingly steady. "She left this morning," he said simply. "She mentioned she had things to do." His casual tone caught Shannon's brother off guard. "Do you know where she went?" he pressed. Joshua paused, then added, "Maybe downtown, I'm not sure." By the next day, the tension had escalated. Shannon's car was discovered abandoned a few blocks away, parked neatly along the curb. The sight of it sent chills down her brother's spine. The car was clean, locked, and devoid of any clues. The keys were nowhere to be found, and the sense of something ominous grew heavier. As the days passed, Shannon's name and face spread across Calgary. Flyers were pinned to lampposts, shared online, and handed out in cafes. Friends and family poured their energy into the search, clinging to hope. Joshua, too, participated, but his presence felt off. He joined search parties and answered questions with a calm that didn't match the chaos around him. "We'll find her," he told a group of volunteers. But his words felt hollow, rehearsed, as though he was reciting a line from a play. Police quickly became involved, interviewing those closest to Shannon. Her friends painted a vivid picture of her last few weeks, her excitement about Vancouver, her dissatisfaction with her marriage, and her fear that Joshua wouldn't let her go. Lisa, her best friend, struggled to keep her composure during questioning. "Shannon was scared," she admitted. "She told me she felt like Joshua was watching her every move." The investigation intensified when Joshua reported finding Shannon's phone in their home. "It was under the couch," he said during his interview with the police. His claim raised immediate red flags. The phone, Shannon's lifeline, should have been with her. How could it have ended up hidden in their living room? Detective Wilson leaned forward, his voice steady but probing. "You didn't notice it before?" Joshua shook his head. "I don't know how it got there. Maybe she dropped it before she left." The explanation did little to quell the growing unease. Shannon's meticulous nature made it unlikely she'd misplace something as vital as her phone, especially with her move to Vancouver so close. And yet, the device sat there, untouched, its presence raising more questions than answers. Joshua's behavior under scrutiny began to shift. While he initially seemed cooperative, cracks in his story began to form. He avoided eye contact during interviews, his answers growing shorter, more defensive. When asked about the night before Shannon disappeared, he stumbled. We, we argued, he admitted, but it wasn't anything serious, just normal stuff. The calm facade he had maintained was beginning to crumble. Friends and family took notice. Shannon's brother voiced what many were beginning to think. There's something he's not telling us. The search for Shannon continued, but the focus was shifting. What had started as a desperate plea to find a missing woman was evolving into something darker, a growing suspicion that the answers everyone sought might be much closer to home than they ever expected. Detective Wilson sat quietly in the dimly lit interview room studying Joshua Burgess. The husband had maintained his calm facade, but there was something about him, his detached tone, his measured responses, that didn't sit right. "Let's go over this again," Wilson said, his voice steady but firm. "When was the last time you saw Shannon?" Joshua leaned back, his fingers tapping against the table. "She left that morning," he repeated. "I told you already. She had errands to run." But the detective wasn't convinced. There were inconsistencies in Joshua's timeline. And now, with Shannon's phone mysteriously appearing in their living room, Wilson couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was slipping through Joshua's carefully rehearsed answers. Meanwhile, the community's search efforts continued to dominate the streets of Calgary. Volunteers combed through parks, alleys, and wooded areas, their voices calling out Shannon's name into the chilly air. Her family was relentless, organizing daily vigils and pleading for anyone with information to come forward. But as the days dragged on, hope began to wane. Then a break came. A neighbor who lived across the street from Shannon and Joshua stepped forward. "I heard them arguing," she told the police. "It was late at night, a couple of days before she disappeared. There was yelling, and then it just stopped." This revelation added a new layer to the investigation. Wilson pressed Joshua for details about the argument. "What were you fighting about?" he asked. Joshua's composure faltered for the first time. "I don't remember," he said, his voice quieter now. "It was nothing serious, just normal stuff." But Wilson wasn't buying it. He could sense the walls Joshua had built around himself beginning to crack. While Joshua's behavior raised red flags, police turned their attention to Shannon's car, which had been found abandoned a few blocks from the couple's home. Forensic teams scoured the vehicle for clues, but it was spotless. No fingerprints, no personal items, no signs of a struggle. It was as though someone had intentionally cleaned it, ensuring no trace of Shannon's presence remained. Lisa, Shannon's best friend, provided another piece of the puzzle. "Shannon told me she felt like Joshua was watching her all the time," she said during her interview with detectives. "She said she couldn't breathe in that house anymore. She was so ready to leave, but I guess she didn't get the chance." As the investigation unfolded, the pressure on Joshua mounted. Friends and family began to notice subtle changes in his demeanor. He seemed less involved in the search efforts, distancing himself from Shannon's loved ones. At one vigil, he stood in the back, arms crossed, his face blank. When approached by Shannon's brother, Joshua offered little more than a shrug. "We're doing everything we can," he said, but his words lacked conviction, and his eyes refused to meet the other man's. The turning point came when detectives reviewed surveillance footage from a convenience store near Shannon and Joshua's house. On the morning of her disappearance, Joshua was seen purchasing cleaning supplies, bleach, trash bags, and gloves. It was a seemingly mundane transaction, but in the context of Shannon's case, it raised serious questions. Detective Wilson confronted Joshua with the footage during their next interview. Sliding a photograph across the table, he asked, "Why were you buying these things on the day Shannon went missing?" Joshua hesitated, his fingers twitching as he glanced at the image. "It's not what you think," he stammered. I just needed to clean the house. Shannon always liked things tidy." Wilson's silence was deafening. He could feel the tension in the room thickening, the lies unraveling. Joshua looked down, avoiding the detective's piercing gaze. The truth, Wilson knew, was close, so close he could almost feel it. As the investigation entered its second week, whispers of doubt began spreading through the community. Those who had once seen Joshua as a grieving husband now viewed him with suspicion. Shannon's family, once hesitant to accuse him outright, started to question his every move. "There's more to this," her brother told reporters. "We just need to find it." And with each passing day, it became clearer that Joshua's carefully constructed facade was on the verge of collapse. Detective Wilson reviewed the files spread across his desk, the weight of Shannon Madill's disappearance pressing heavily on his mind. It had been nearly 2 weeks since she vanished, and despite the community's tireless efforts, the investigation was yielding more questions than answers. Wilson's instincts, honed over years of solving cases, kept circling back to one person, Joshua Burgess. The timeline provided by Joshua didn't add up. Shannon's car, found parked neatly near their home, was a strange clue. Why would she park there if she was planning to leave town? And the phone, discovered days later under the couch, felt like a deliberate distraction rather than a genuine lead. Something about Joshua's demeanor also didn't sit right. While most family members of missing persons were frantic and emotional, Joshua was composed, too composed. "Let's start with the basics," Wilson muttered to his team during the morning briefing. "Shannon didn't just disappear into thin air. Someone knows something." He assigned detectives to canvass the neighborhood again, hoping to unearth anything that might have been overlooked. Later that day, a neighbor came forward with a disturbing account. "I heard shouting 2 nights before she went missing," she told officers. "It sounded like a fight and like something big, then it just went quiet." Wilson seized on the statement. Confronting Joshua, he asked, "What happened during that argument?" "Your neighbor heard shouting." Joshua's jaw tightened, his calm facade slipping for the briefest moment. "We argue sometimes, like any couple," he said flatly. "It wasn't anything serious." But Wilson wasn't convinced. Joshua's demeanor had shifted, his answers growing shorter, his body language more defensive. "It wasn't anything serious," Joshua repeated, but the detective's piercing gaze lingered, as if daring him to elaborate. He didn't. Meanwhile, Shannon's family pressed forward with their own search efforts. Her brother, now growing increasingly suspicious of Joshua, started publicly questioning his behavior. "If you cared so much, why aren't you doing more?" he snapped during a vigil, his voice breaking with frustration. Joshua's response was icy. "I'm doing what I can," he said, but his lack of emotion only deepened the rift between him and Shannon's loved ones. Then came the breakthrough. Reviewing surveillance footage from a nearby hardware store, detectives discovered a critical lead. Joshua had been seen purchasing cleaning supplies, bleach, gloves, trash bags, on the day Shannon went missing. The footage sent alarm bells ringing. Wilson didn't hesitate. He brought Joshua back in for questioning, sliding a still image from the video across the table. "What's this about?" Wilson asked, his tone calm but unwavering. Joshua stared at the photo, his fingers twitching slightly. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered. "I was cleaning the house. Shannon liked things neat." Wilson leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You don't buy bleach and trash bags unless you're hiding something." The room grew tense, the seconds stretching into an oppressive silence. Joshua avoided Wilson's gaze, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. At the same time, forensic teams examined Shannon's car more thoroughly. The vehicle, though spotless, yielded an unsettling clue. Faint traces of soil on the tires, soil that didn't match the area where it had been found. This discovery suggested the car had been moved, perhaps to stage her disappearance. As the puzzle pieces began falling into place, Wilson felt the noose tightening around Joshua. But they still lacked one thing: Shannon. Without her, the case was incomplete, and the uncertainty gnawed at everyone involved. While Joshua maintained his innocence, the community's patience was wearing thin. Whispers of suspicion spread like wildfire, fueled by his increasingly erratic behavior. At a press conference organized by Shannon's family, her mother fought back tears as she addressed the crowd. "We just want her back," she pleaded. "If anyone knows anything, please, don't stay silent." The plea was met with solemn nods, but in the back of the room, Joshua stood motionless, his expression unreadable. Wilson watched him closely, the unease in his gut growing stronger. Whatever Joshua was hiding, Wilson knew it wouldn't stay buried forever. Detective Wilson stood at the edge of the backyard, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the freshly disturbed soil. The warrant to search Joshua Burgess's property had come after weeks of relentless investigation. Now, with shovels in hand, forensic teams prepared to uncover what lay beneath. There was a stillness in the air, broken only by the soft crunch of boots on gravel, as officers moved purposefully across the yard. Joshua had been removed from the premises earlier that morning. His protests were calm but firm, his voice devoid of panic. "You won't find anything here," he insisted as officers escorted him out. But the subtle clench of his jaw and the way his eyes darted toward the garden betrayed him. Wilson had seen this before, the quiet desperation of someone who knew their secrets were about to surface. The digging began methodically, each scoop of earth revealing layers of unease. The officers worked in silence, their breaths visible in the cool air. Wilson's heart pounded in his chest as he watched, his instincts screaming that this was the moment everything would change. And then it happened. A metallic thunk, the sound of something unnatural breaking the rhythm of the shovel's descent. "Hold up!" one of the forensic technicians called out, his voice tight. All movement stopped as the team gathered around the area. Carefully, they brushed away the dirt, revealing the edges of a plastic storage bin buried deep in the soil. The color, faded and dull, seemed to mock the vibrant life it now concealed. Wilson stepped closer, his throat tightening. "Document everything," he instructed, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Cameras flashed as the technicians carefully lifted the bin from the ground. The lid was sealed, but the weight of its contents was undeniable. One of the officers exchanged a glance with Wilson, a silent question hanging in the air. Wilson nodded. "Open it." The lid creaked as it was pried free, and the reality of what they had found hit with brutal force. The unmistakable form of Shannon Madill lay inside, her once bright presence now reduced to a haunting silence. The air seemed to leave the yard, replaced by an oppressive stillness as everyone processed the grim discovery. Wilson took a step back, his mind racing. Months of unanswered questions now had a horrific answer. Shannon hadn't disappeared. She had been silenced, hidden away mere feet from the home she had shared with Joshua. The implications were staggering, the weight of the truth pressing down like a vice. The scene was quickly secured as forensic teams moved in to document every detail. Wilson watched as they worked, his emotions a tangled mix of anger, sorrow, and a relentless determination to see justice served. He thought of Shannon's family, their hope, their pleas for answers, and how this discovery would shatter them. But it would also give them something they desperately needed: closure. By the time Joshua was brought back in for questioning, the evidence was irrefutable. Dirt from the backyard clung to his boots, matching the soil samples taken from the bin's exterior. Forensics confirmed the timeline. Shannon had been buried within hours of her disappearance. Every piece of evidence pointed to the man who had claimed to love her. Joshua sat across from Wilson in the interrogation room, his hands clasped tightly together. For the first time, the composure he had clung to so desperately began to crack. His breathing quickened, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "Why, Joshua?" Wilson's voice cut through the silence, steady but unrelenting. "Why did you do it?" Joshua's lips trembled as he struggled to find the words. We argued," he stammered. "She wanted to leave, and I couldn't let her. I didn't mean to. I lost control." The confession, while expected, still hit like a gut punch. Wilson leaned back, his gaze never leaving Joshua's. "You buried her in your backyard," he said, his tone heavy with disbelief. "You hid her there, while her family searched for her." Joshua's head dropped, his hands shaking. "I didn't know what else to do," he whispered. "I panicked." Wilson's jaw tightened as he stood, his chair scraping against the floor. There was no satisfaction in hearing Joshua's words, only a hollow sense of finality. Shannon deserved so much more than what had been done to her. Outside the station, the sky was beginning to darken, the weight of the day settling over the city. But for Wilson, the work was far from over. The discovery beneath the backyard was just the beginning. Justice for Shannon Madill demanded more, and he was determined to see it through. The air in the interrogation room was heavy, the kind of silence that amplified every breath and every fidget. Joshua Burgess sat across from Detective Wilson, his shoulders hunched, as though the weight of the truth was finally too much to bear. His carefully constructed facade had crumbled with the discovery of Shannon's body in the backyard, a place meant for life and joy, now forever tainted by his horrifying actions. Wilson broke the silence first. "Joshua, you need to start talking. The evidence is overwhelming. Shannon didn't just vanish. You made sure of that." His voice was calm but unrelenting, like a tide that wouldn't recede until the full story emerged. Joshua's eyes darted toward the door, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. "I didn't mean to," he began, his voice cracking. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Wilson leaned in, his gaze sharp. What wasn't supposed to happen, Joshua? Did you plan this? Did you think no one would notice she was gone? Joshua's words spilled out in fragments, each sentence a jagged piece of a broken puzzle. We fought that night. She told me she was leaving, that she was done with me, with this life. He paused, his breath shallow. I begged her to stay. I told her I could change, but she wouldn't listen. What happened next? Wilson pressed, his voice steady but firm. Joshua's body tensed, and the confession tumbled out. She said it was over, Joshua whispered, his voice barely audible. She said she was going to Vancouver, that she didn't care about what I thought anymore. His eyes glistened with a mix of anger and sorrow. I couldn't let her go. I grabbed her, tried to stop her from leaving. Wilson's jaw tightened, but he let Joshua continue. The man's words grew more frantic, as if speaking them aloud might absolve him. She pushed me away, told me to get out of her life, and then, I don't know what happened. I just snapped. One minute we were yelling, and the next, he stopped, his hands trembling violently. I didn't mean to hurt her. I swear I didn't. The room fell silent for a moment, Wilson allowing the weight of Joshua's confession to settle. Then he spoke, his voice cold and sharp. But you did hurt her. You took her life, and instead of calling for help, you buried her in your backyard, like she didn't matter. Joshua's head dropped, his hands covering his face. I panicked, he murmured. I didn't know what else to do. I was scared. Scared of what everyone would think. What would happen to me? Wilson stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Scared of what would happen to you? He snapped. What about Shannon? What about her family, who has been searching for her, hoping she was still alive? Did you think about them? Joshua didn't answer. His silence spoke volumes, a stark reminder of the selfishness and cowardice that had defined his every action since that fateful night. The confession was recorded in its entirety, a damning account that left no room for doubt. Outside the interrogation room, Shannon's family awaited news. When Wilson emerged, his face grim, they knew. Shannon was gone, and the man they had once trusted had stolen her from them. Her mother's cries echoed through the halls of the station, a raw, unfiltered expression of grief that pierced even the most hardened officers. Shannon's brother clenched his fists, his knuckles white with rage. He doesn't deserve to walk free, he muttered, his voice shaking. Not after what he's done. As the day wore on, the reality of Joshua's confession spread throughout the community. Shock turned to anger, and anger to calls for justice. Shannon's name, once associated with laughter and light, was now a rallying cry for accountability. And though her story had reached a devastating conclusion, her memory would not be silenced. The house was silent, but the walls seemed to echo with memories of Shannon. Her parents sat at the dining table staring at a picture of their daughter, a photo taken on her last birthday. Her smile radiated life, but now it was a haunting reminder of what had been stolen from them. The reality of her death and the revelation that Joshua Burgess, the man they had once welcomed into their family, was responsible, left them in pieces. Shannon's mother clutched the picture tightly, her fingers trembling. How could we not see it? She whispered, her voice breaking. How could we let her live with him, thinking she was safe? Her father, normally a pillar of strength, had no answers. His jaw clenched as he fought back tears, his hand resting on hers. She trusted him, he said quietly, the weight of the words filling the room, and we trusted him too. Across town, Shannon's brother sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The rage within him boiled over, consuming every thought. Joshua's confession played on a loop in his mind, each word like a knife twisting in his chest. I couldn't let her leave, Joshua had said. The sheer selfishness of it was unbearable. You didn't own her, he muttered under his breath, his voice filled with venom. She wasn't yours to control. The family's grief was compounded by the media frenzy surrounding the case. News outlets ran headline after headline, dissecting every detail of Shannon's life and death. Strangers offered condolences on social media, while others cruelly speculated about her marriage, her choices, even her character. The invasion felt unbearable. They don't know her, Shannon's mother said, her voice trembling with anger. They don't know what a beautiful soul she was. Lisa, Shannon's best friend, arrived later that day. The moment she walked in, she was engulfed in a hug by Shannon's mother, the two women holding each other as tears streamed down their faces. She didn't deserve this, Lisa choked out. She had so much more to give, so much more to live for. The family gathered that evening to plan a memorial for Shannon, but every step felt like a dagger to the heart. Choosing photos for the service was almost impossible. Each image carried a story, a memory, a moment of joy, now shadowed by tragedy. Her brother stared at a picture of Shannon performing stand-up comedy, her face lit with passion. She was so happy that night, he said softly. She had finally found her voice. As they worked, a knock at the door startled them. Detective Wilson stood on the porch, his expression somber but resolute. "I just wanted to check in," he said, stepping inside. "We're building a solid case. Joshua won't walk away from this." Shannon's father nodded, his face set with determination. "He better not," he replied, "because if he does, there won't be any justice left in this world." Wilson stayed for a while, offering updates on the investigation and answering the family's questions. His presence was a small comfort, a reminder that Shannon's voice would not be silenced. As he left, he paused at the door, glancing back at the family. "I know this doesn't bring her back," he said gently, "but I promise you, we'll get justice for her." The family's grief was a raw, unending wave, but in the midst of their despair, there was a flicker of resolve. They wouldn't let Shannon be defined by her death. Her life, her dreams, her laughter, those were the things they would fight to remember and preserve. In the days that followed, they began organizing a public vigil for Shannon, inviting the community to join them in honoring her memory. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. Hundreds of people gathered, holding candles that lit up the night like stars. Her father stepped forward to speak, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Shannon was more than what happened to her," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "She was a light in this world, and while that light has been taken from us, we won't let it be forgotten." The crowd murmured in agreement, their candles flickering in the wind. For a moment, the weight of grief lifted, replaced by a collective sense of purpose. Shannon's family vowed to channel their pain into action, ensuring that her story would be a beacon of hope and a call for change. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back walls, their cameras poised to capture every moment. Shannon Madill's family sat in the front row, their faces a blend of grief and steely determination. Across the aisle, Joshua Burgess sat at the defendant's table, his once calm demeanor replaced by a tense, hollow expression. The trial that would decide his fate was about to begin. The prosecution opened with a blistering statement, painting Joshua as a controlling, manipulative husband whose selfishness led to Shannon's tragic death. "This was not a momentary lapse in judgment," the prosecutor declared, his voice firm and unyielding. "This was the deliberate act of a man who refused to let go." The courtroom hung on every word, the tension thick as a storm cloud. Joshua's defense team attempted to counter this narrative, framing the incident as an unplanned, emotional outburst. "Joshua Burgess is not a monster," his attorney argued. "He is a man who made a terrible mistake in a moment of anger. This is not premeditated murder. This is a tragedy born out of human imperfection." The words rang hollow to Shannon's family, who exchanged anguished glances. The trial unfolded with a harrowing series of testimonies. Detective Wilson took the stand, methodically recounting the investigation that led to Joshua's arrest. He described the inconsistencies in Joshua's statements, the damning surveillance footage, and the grim discovery of Shannon's body in the backyard. "Every piece of evidence pointed back to him," Wilson concluded, his voice steady but weighted with emotion. "This was no accident." Shannon's brother was next to testify, his voice trembling as he spoke about the last conversation he had with his sister. "She told me she felt trapped," he said, his eyes locked on Joshua. "She wanted to leave, but she was scared of what he might do." The words cut through the courtroom like a blade, the raw pain in his voice palpable. The most devastating moment came when Shannon's mother took the stand. Clutching a tissue in her hand, she described the vibrant, loving person her daughter had been. "Shannon was our light," she said, her voice breaking. "She trusted Joshua, we all did, and he betrayed that trust in the worst way imaginable." Joshua's confession, played for the court, was the nail in the coffin. The jury listened intently as his voice filled the room, shaky and broken. "I couldn't let her leave," he admitted. "I didn't mean to kill her, I just lost control." The words, though damning, did little to evoke sympathy. They only underscored the selfishness that had driven his actions. The prosecution seized on this, emphasizing how Joshua's decision to bury Shannon in the backyard showed a calculated effort to cover his tracks. "This was not the act of a remorseful man," the prosecutor argued. This was the act of a man desperate to save himself. As the trial neared its conclusion, the jury was left to deliberate. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as everyone awaited the verdict. Shannon's family held hands, their silent prayers filling the space between them. Joshua sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor. When the jury returned, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The foreperson stood, her voice clear and unwavering. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Joshua Burgess, guilty of second-degree murder." The words reverberated through the room, a mix of relief and sorrow washing over Shannon's family. Her mother wept openly, her husband wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Joshua's expression remained blank, but his hands clenched tightly as the reality of his fate settled in. The judge delivered the sentence, life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. For Shannon's family, the sentence felt both like justice and a cruel reminder of how fleeting that justice could be. "10 years isn't enough," her brother muttered, his jaw tight. "It'll never be enough." As the court adjourned, the family lingered for a moment, gazing at the now empty defendant's table. Shannon's father spoke softly, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "This isn't over. We'll fight to make sure he never walks free." Outside, reporters clamored for statements, but Shannon's family moved silently through the crowd, their heads held high. They had fought for justice and won, but the weight of their loss remained. Shannon's story wasn't just about tragedy. It was a call to action, a demand for change, and a legacy that would not be forgotten. The verdict sent shockwaves through the community. The words "guilty of second-degree murder" offered some relief to Shannon Madill's family, but the sentencing, a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 10 years, ignited a firestorm of public outrage. For many, it wasn't enough. How could a man who had taken a life so brutally, then buried her in their backyard, even be considered for parole in a decade? Social media exploded with reactions. Posts flooded every platform with hashtags like #JusticeForShannon and #10years, is not enough trending within hours. Strangers shared photos of Shannon's vibrant smile and called for harsher consequences for domestic violence perpetrators. "Shannon's life was worth more than 10 years, one user wrote. "The system has failed her and her family." Shannon's family, already grappling with their loss, now faced the added burden of speaking out against what they felt was an unjust sentence. Her brother, who had remained composed throughout the trial, could no longer contain his anger. Standing before a sea of cameras outside the courthouse, he addressed the media with raw emotion. 10 years? That's all her life was worth to this system. She was more than a statistic. She was my sister, and she deserved better. His words reverberated through the crowd, igniting a collective sense of indignation. Protests were organized in downtown Calgary, with hundreds gathering to demand reforms to sentencing laws for domestic violence cases. Candles lit the evening sky as speakers shared stories of loved ones lost to similar tragedies. Shannon's mother, clutching a photo of her daughter, stepped forward to speak. Her voice was steady, but her pain was evident. "We can't bring Shannon back, but we can fight to make sure no other family endures this pain. This sentence is a slap in the face, not just to us, but to every victim of domestic violence." As the weeks passed, the outrage continued to grow. Community leaders and activists joined the conversation, pushing for legislative changes that would prevent similar sentences in the future. Letters poured into the offices of lawmakers demanding action. Shannon's name became a rallying cry for reform, a symbol of the fight against leniency for violent crimes. Amid the public uproar, Joshua's defense team filed an appeal, seeking a reduction in his sentence. The news hit Shannon's family like another blow. "He's taken everything from us," her father said, his voice shaking. "And now he wants more? It's disgusting." The appeal only fueled the anger of those advocating for Shannon. Petitions circulated, gathering tens of thousands of signatures to ensure Joshua would never walk free. The campaign reached beyond Calgary, gaining attention from national media outlets. Shannon's story became a flashpoint in the larger conversation about systemic failures in addressing domestic violence and the lasting impact on victims' families. Detective Wilson, watching the developments from the sidelines, couldn't shake the feeling that justice was slipping through their fingers. "This case has to mean something," he told a colleague. "If we don't fix what's broken, Shannon's death will have been in vain." Amid the turmoil, Shannon's family continued their fight, determined to honor her memory by pushing for change. They established the Shannon Madill Foundation, aimed at providing resources and support for those trapped in abusive relationships. The foundation became a beacon of hope for others, a way to turn their grief into action. At a press conference for the foundation's launch, Shannon's brother addressed the crowd, his voice resolute. "We can't change what happened to Shannon," he said, "but we can fight to make sure her story is a catalyst for change. We owe her that much." The community's response was overwhelming, with donations and support flooding in from across the country. Shannon's legacy was no longer defined by the tragedy of her death, but by the movement it inspired, a movement that refused to let her story fade into obscurity. Despite the progress, the wound left by Shannon's loss remained fresh for her family. Her mother, speaking in a quiet moment after the event, summed up their ongoing struggle. "Every day without her is a battle," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "But knowing we're making a difference, that's what keeps us going." The fight for justice wasn't over, and for Shannon's family and the countless others who rallied behind them, it never would be. The room was filled with a warm glow, candles flickering softly against the backdrop of photographs and mementos that celebrated Shannon Madill's life. Friends, family, and members of the community gathered at the memorial service, their hearts heavy with sorrow, yet buoyed by a shared determination to honor her memory. Every detail of the event had been meticulously planned by her family, a labor of love meant to capture the essence of the vibrant woman Shannon had been. On a small stage, a microphone stood ready. Her father approached it slowly, holding a piece of paper that trembled slightly in his hands. His voice, though soft, carried the weight of his grief and pride as he began to speak. "Shannon was more than just our daughter. She was a force of nature," he said, pausing to collect himself. "She brought laughter, light, and love into every room she entered. And though her time with us was far too short, her impact will last forever." The audience nodded in silent agreement, many wiping away tears as they listened. Her mother sat in the front row, holding Shannon's brother's hand tightly. Beside them, Lisa, Shannon's best friend, clutched a photograph of the two of them laughing at a comedy club years ago. The pain of her loss was etched into every face in the room. As the service continued, a video montage played on a screen at the front of the room. Clips of Shannon performing stand-up comedy, her expressive face lighting up with joy, filled the air with echoes of laughter. The audience smiled through their tears, the sound a bittersweet reminder of the brilliance she had shared with the world. The final clip in the montage was a candid moment. Shannon sitting with her family, teasing her brother about something trivial, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Life's too short to take seriously," she said, laughing. The room fell silent as the video faded to black, her words lingering in the air like a mantra. Lisa approached the microphone next, her voice trembling but resolute. "Shannon had this incredible ability to make you feel seen," she began. "Whether you were laughing at her jokes or just sitting in her presence, she made you feel like you mattered. And that's the legacy she leaves behind, a reminder to love fiercely, to laugh often, and to live unapologetically." The room erupted into applause, the sound reverberating with a mix of pain and gratitude. For a moment it felt as though Shannon was there with them, her energy alive in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by her life. After the service, guests lingered to share stories and offer words of comfort to the family. One by one, they approached Shannon's parents, recounting memories that showcased her kindness, humor, and indomitable spirit. "She helped me through a really dark time," one friend admitted, her voice breaking. "She didn't have to, but that's just who she was." Outside, the evening air was crisp, the sky dotted with stars. Guests gathered for a candlelight vigil, the soft glow of the flames illuminating their faces as they stood in solidarity. Shannon's brother lit the first candle, passing the flame along until every person held a tiny beacon of light. "This is for Shannon," he said, his voice strong despite the tears in his eyes, "to remind us that even in the darkest times, her light still shines." The crowd murmured in agreement, holding their candles high as a moment of silence enveloped them. It was a collective act of remembrance, a powerful gesture that spoke to the profound impact Shannon had on their lives. As the vigil ended, her family stood together watching as the crowd slowly dispersed. Shannon's mother spoke softly, her words meant for her daughter. "We'll never stop loving you," she whispered, "and we'll never stop fighting to keep your memory alive." In the days that followed, Shannon's family channeled their grief into action. They worked tirelessly to grow the foundation they had established in her honor, using it as a platform to support victims of domestic violence and advocate for stronger protections. Shannon's story became a symbol of resilience, her name synonymous with the fight for justice and change. Though the pain of her absence remained, the family found solace in knowing that Shannon's legacy was one of love and strength, a legacy that would continue to inspire others for generations to come. The story of Shannon Madill left a mark far beyond her immediate circle. Her vibrant life, tragically cut short, sparked a national conversation about the unseen dangers in toxic relationships and the systems that often fail to protect the vulnerable. In the aftermath of her death, the lessons drawn from her story became a rallying cry for change. At the heart of the movement was Shannon's family. They had transformed their grief into action, founding the Shannon Madill Foundation to support victims of domestic violence. The foundation provided resources, counseling, and education, ensuring that no one would feel as trapped and isolated as Shannon had in her final days. If she had access to something like this, maybe things could have been different, her mother said in a televised interview, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Public awareness campaigns grew in her name, emphasizing the importance of recognizing the warning signs of abusive relationships. Billboards and social media posts featured her smiling face alongside phrases like, "Love shouldn't hurt," and "break the silence." Her family worked tirelessly to amplify the message, speaking at schools, community centers, and public events. Shannon always wanted to make people laugh, her brother explained during one event. Now we're using her voice to save lives. One of the most powerful moments came during a legislative hearing in Calgary, where Shannon's parents testified before lawmakers. They shared her story with harrowing detail, painting a vivid picture of the vibrant, loving woman she had been and how she had been failed. "We trusted the system to protect her," her father said, his voice filled with quiet fury. "It didn't, and it won't unless we change it." Their words inspired tangible action. New laws were proposed, aimed at tightening sentences for violent offenders and providing better support for survivors of domestic abuse. Shannon's story became a centerpiece for these reforms, her name etched into the fight for justice. But beyond the policy changes, her story resonated on a deeply personal level for many. Letters poured into the foundation from individuals who saw themselves in Shannon's experience. Survivors shared their own stories of escape, while others admitted her tragedy had opened their eyes to the warning signs in their own relationships. "She saved my life," one woman wrote. "Her story gave me the courage to leave before it was too late." Lisa, Shannon's best friend, reflected on the ripple effects of her legacy during an interview. "She always wanted to be remembered," Lisa said, her voice breaking with emotion. "And now she will be, just not in the way any of us wanted." Despite the progress, Shannon's family knew their fight was far from over. The pain of her absence lingered, an ache that time could dull but never erase. Yet, in the faces of those who had been helped by the foundation, they found a bittersweet solace. Each life saved, each person empowered, was a testament to Shannon's enduring impact. One quiet evening, Shannon's mother sat in her garden, a place that had become her refuge. The stars were bright, the air crisp, and the scent of flowers filled the space around her. In her lap was Shannon's journal filled with pages of dreams and reflections. One passage, written just weeks before her death, stood out. "I want to be remembered for the good I've done, for the laughter I've shared, and for the lives I've touched." Tears rolled down her mother's cheeks as she read the words, her heart heavy yet full of pride. Shannon's light, though extinguished too soon, continued to shine in the lives she had inspired, and in the movement she had unwittingly begun. The lessons from Shannon's story were clear. No one should feel alone in their struggle. No one should ignore the signs of danger, and no one's life should be reduced to a statistic. Through her family's tireless efforts and the unwavering support of a community united by grief and hope, Shannon's legacy became a beacon, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always the possibility of light. The courtroom battles were over, the headlines had faded, and the protests had quieted. Yet for Shannon Madill's family, the aftermath of her death remained an unending journey of grief, resilience, and reflection. The world had moved on, but their lives would never return to what they once were. Shannon's father sat in the quiet of the family home, staring at the untouched piano in the corner of the living room. It was where Shannon had often played when she visited, her laughter filling the space between the melodies. Now the silence was a stark reminder of her absence. "I keep thinking she'll walk through the door," he said softly to her mother one evening. Like all of this was just some terrible dream. Her mother nodded, wiping away a tear. But then reality hits, she replied, and we remember she's not coming back. Despite their pain, the family continued their mission. The Shannon Madill Foundation had become a beacon of hope for survivors of domestic violence. Hundreds of women had reached out for help, finding refuge and strength through the programs the foundation provided. It's what Shannon would have wanted, her mother often said, to know that her story wasn't in vain. Yet the fight wasn't without its challenges. News of Joshua Burgess's appeal brought fresh waves of anger and fear. Shannon's brother, who had thrown himself into the foundation's work, was particularly vocal. "We can't let him walk free," he said during a televised interview. "He took her life. He doesn't deserve another chance at his." The family rallied their community once more, gathering signatures, hosting events, and speaking out against leniency for violent offenders. Their efforts reached far beyond Calgary, sparking conversations about the justice system and its treatment of domestic violence cases. Shannon's name became a symbol of resilience and reform, a legacy that her family clung to amidst their grief. 1 year after the trial, the family held a private ceremony to mark the anniversary of Shannon's death. They gathered in her favorite park, surrounded by friends and supporters who had stood by them through the darkest days. Each person held a white balloon, a tribute to Shannon's vibrant spirit. As her brother stepped forward to speak, his voice wavered but carried a quiet strength. "Shannon taught us to love fiercely, to fight for what matters, and to never give up," he said. "We carry her with us every day, in everything we do, and though she's gone, her light will never fade." The balloons were released into the sky, drifting upward as the crowd watched in silence. It was a poignant moment, a shared promise to keep Shannon's memory alive and to continue the work her story had inspired. Later that evening, her mother sat at her desk writing a letter she knew Shannon would never read. It was something she had started doing in the months after her death, a way to feel connected to her daughter. "Dear Shannon," she wrote, "today we honored you again. I hope you saw the balloons, the love, and the impact you've made. Your light still shines, my sweet girl. It shines in the lives you've saved, in the laughter we share in your memory, and in the strength you've given us to keep going. We miss you every moment of every day, but we'll keep fighting, for you and for everyone who needs it." Tears blurred her vision as she folded the letter and placed it in a box with the others. It was her way of keeping Shannon close, a reminder that their bond could never be broken. In the years to come, the family's work would continue to grow, touching lives across the country. Laws inspired by Shannon's case would pass, providing stronger protections for victims of domestic violence. Her story, though born of tragedy, became a force for change, a testament to the enduring power of love, hope, and the human spirit. Shannon's legacy was not just a memory, it was a movement, a reminder that even in the face of unspeakable loss, there is strength to be found, battles to be fought, and lives to be saved. And in that, she would never truly be gone. What do you think of Joshua Burgess and his actions? Do you believe justice was truly served in this case? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stories like this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for the latest true crime stories and updates. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.